P. George is McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and founder and director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. He's also a professor of politics and an associated faculty member of the Department of Philosophy at Princeton. He's a member of the President's Council on Bioethics and previously served as a presidential appointee to the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He's a former judicial fellow at the Supreme Court of the United States, where he received the Justice Tom C. Clark Award. Professor George is author of several books, including Making Man Moral, his first book, actually, which you saw to me last night. Making Man Moral, Civil Liberties and Public Morality, which was published in 1993. Then in 1999, In Defense of Natural Law. 2001, The Clash of Orthodoxies. Conseguem ouvir?
Não.
Não.
Levantar o som.
Making Man Moral, In Defense of Natural Law, and The Clash of Orthodoxies. The Clash of Orthodoxies was published in English in 2001, and this is the book that is now available in Portuguese at the hall outside. And that Professor George will be so kind as to sign copies for us after the session today. Professor George is also editor of several volumes, including Natural Law Theory, Contemporary Essays in 1992, The Autonomy of Law, Essays on Legal Positivism, 1996, Natural Law, Liberalism and Morality, 1996 too, and Great Cases in Constitutional Law in the year 2000. And he is also co-editor with Jean Elstein of The Meaning of Marriage, quite a topical topic, I would say, these days, and it was published in 2005. He is co-author of two new books, Embryo, The Case for Human Life, published by Doubleday, and Self-Body Dualism and Contemporary Ethical and Political Controversies by Cambridge University Press. Professor George's articles and reviews essays have appeared in the Harvard Law Review, the Yale Law Journal, the Columbia Law Review, University of Chicago Law Review, the Review of Politics, the Review of Metaphysics, and the American Journal of Jurisprudence. He's a frequent contributor to First Things, which is, by the way, available in our common room, the magazine, where he's a member of the editorial advisory board, and has also written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, National Review, Touchstone, the Boston Review, City Journal, and the Times Literary Supplement. A graduate of Swarthmore College and Harvard Law School, Professor George also earned a master's degree in theology from Harvard and a doctorate in philosophy of law from Oxford University. He was elected to Phi Beta Kappa at Swarthmore and received a Knox Fellowship from Harvard for graduate study in law and philosophy at Oxford. He holds honorary doctorates of law, letters, ethics, human letters, civil law, and science. Among his awards and prizes are the Bradley Prize for Intellectual and Civic Achievement, the Philip Merrill Award of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni, the Sidney Hook Award of the National Association of Scholars, the Richard M. Weaver Award for Scholarly Letters, the Paul Bator Award of the Federalist Society for Law and Public Policy, a Silver Gavel Award of the American Bar Association, and a Stanley Kelly Jr. Teaching Award in Politics at Princeton. That's quite a list. He was the 2007 John Dewey Lecturer in Philosophy of Law at Harvard. Professor George serves on the boards of directors of the Lyndon Harry Bradley Foundation, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, the Institute for American Values, the Institute on Religion and Democracy, the Family Research Council, and the Center for Individual Rights. He serves on editorial boards of the American Journal of Jurisprudence, the Journal of International Biotechnology, biotechnology law and Touchstone and 13th magazines. Professor George is also general editor of New Forum Books, a Princeton University Press series of interdisciplinary works in law, culture, and politics. In addition to his academic work, he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and serves as of counsel to the law firms of Robinson and McQuilly. Well, right. Well, this is quite impressive. Professor George, it's a great honor to have you with us today. Thank you very much for coming. It's your pleasure.
I'm very grateful to Professor Espada and to the rector of the university for this wonderful opportunity to visit with you to give the Alexis de Tocqueville Distinguished Annual Lecture. It's a special privilege to be giving this lecture because I look at the past lecturers and see that they are not only persons of great eminence, but in some cases very dear friends of mine as well. So I consider myself to be in very good company with the previous lecturers. I'm glad to be your guest here. I must, however, begin with two apologies. The first is that I am unable to address you in your beautiful Portuguese language. I wish it were otherwise, and I'm very grateful to you for listening to me speak in English. My family is now rectifying my deficiency. My son, who is a student at Princeton University where I teach, his major field is Portuguese. So I'm going to have him check the translation of Professor Espada's introduction to my book to make sure it says very good things about me. Otherwise, he's going to hear from me. And I have a second apology to make. We have a saying in the United States that when one is a guest, one must never talk about politics or religion. I am your guest, and I am going to talk to you about nothing but politics and religion. So I apologize for that. Let me now add a third apology. The very first paragraph of the remarks that I will give on the topic natural law, God, and human rights, the very first paragraph, you will find opaque, very abstract and difficult to understand. But I make you a promise as well as an apology that I will, in the course of the lecture, explain what I mean by the opening words of the lecture, so that about halfway through the lecture, you will at least understand what I'm saying. You may agree, you may disagree, but at least you will understand. So that's my promise. Theories of natural law are critical reflective accounts of the constitutive aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of human persons and the communities they form. Such theories will propose to identify principles of right action, that is, moral principles, specifying the first and most general principle of morality, namely, that one should choose and act in ways that are compatible with a will to integral human fulfillment. Among these principles are respect for rights people possess simply by virtue of their humanity, rights which as a matter of justice, others, all of us, are bound to respect, and governments are bound not only to respect, but to the extent possible, also to protect. Well, that is a very abstract paragraph to open, but I will explain. Now, natural law theorists of natural law of my particular ilk, understand human fulfillment, the human good, as variegated, and this is very important. There are many irreducible aspects of human well-being, not just one. And when I say that there are many aspects of human well-being, human fulfillment, the human good, that are irreducible. I mean that they are reducible neither to each other, nor to some common factor that all of them have, manifesting differently. Now, in asserting this pluralism of basic aspects of human well-being, I am not denying that human nature is determinate. On the contrary, like all natural law theorists, I believe that human nature is determinate. It is to affirm that our nature, though determinate, is complex. We are animals, but rational. No one has yet, to my knowledge, improved on Aristotle's basic understanding of a human being, a rational animal. He's both, an animal and rational. Our integral good includes our bodily well-being. We are animals, we have bodies. We can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of the health and well-being of the body. But our integral good includes, in addition to our physical well-being, our bodily well-being, also our intellectual, moral, and spiritual well-being. And there is more to the complexity of the human being. We are individuals. We come packaged as individual organisms with individual minds, individual emotions. But though we are individuals, friendship and sociability, being in relationships with others, these are constitutive aspects of our flourishing. We can flourish or fail to flourish in respect of our relationships, the quality of our relationships with other people. Good relationships, healthy relationships, fulfilling relationships, friendships with others are not merely instrumental goods for us. They are intrinsic goods. They are irreducible aspects of our flourishing as human beings. On this, again, Aristotle cannot be improved upon. You look at his treatment of friendship in Book 10 of the Nicomachean Ethics, there is very little to add except perhaps a footnote. So, our good as human beings, complex creatures, is itself complex. By reflecting on the basic goods of human nature, especially those pertaining most directly to social and political life, natural law theorists propose to arrive at a sound understanding of principles of justice, including those principles we call human rights. We speak very freely these days about human rights, but too often we fail to think about the concept of human rights rigorously. I propose this evening to offer some reflections that I hope will be rigorous about the concept of human rights. Now, natural law theorists typically reject both strict individualism of the libertarian sort and also collectivism. Natural law theorists typically reject both of these extremes on the spectrum. Individualism, from the perspective of the natural law theorist, overlooks the intrinsic value of human sociability. It fails to understand that our relationships with others, our sociability, our friendships, are intrinsic and not merely instrumental aspects of our well-being and fulfillment. And so the radical individualist tends to view the human being atomistically. Collectivism makes a different mistake. It compromises the dignity of the human being by tending to instrumentalize and subordinate the human person and the well-being of the human individual to the interests of larger social units, to the interests of collectivities. And of course we see this in its most extreme form in the totalitarian systems of the 20th century, fascism and communism. Now, individualists and collectivists both have theories of justice and human rights. They are interesting theories. Some have been set forward with great intelligence. But nevertheless, I see these theories, whether individualist or collectivist,
as highly unsatisfactory. I believe that neither account, neither the individualist nor the collectivist account, can do justice to the key concept that we must focus on if we want to understand human rights. That is the concept of a person. What do I mean by a person? Well, a rational animal who is a locus of intrinsic value and as such an end in himself, who may never legitimately treat himself or be treated by others as a mere means, but whose well-being intrinsically includes relationships with others and membership in communities in which he has, as a matter of both justice and rights and responsibilities. Now here, of course, I'm speaking of human persons. If there are divine persons, if there are angelic persons, these are not persons with bodies. So the concept of a body is not intrinsic to the idea of a person. The concept of rationality, freedom of the will, these are intrinsic to the concept of a person. But if we're talking about a human person, because a human being is an embodied creature, having both body and mind, then we are talking about a rational animal, one whose well-being includes relationships with others, one who, because of his dignity, may never treat himself or be treated by others as a mere instrumentality, a mere object, a mere piece of property, a means to other ends. Immanuel Kant captured this idea very well in his third formulation of the categorical imperative, that we must treat humanity, whether in the person of oneself or another, always as an end and never as a means only. Now, human rights exist if it is the case that there are principles of practical reason directing us to act or abstain from acting in certain ways out of respect for the well-being and dignity of persons whose legitimate interests our actions may affect. Now, I certainly believe that there are such principles. I believe that there are human rights. And if there are human rights, then by virtue of the kind of thing they are, what it means to say there's a human right, they cannot be overridden by considerations of utility. So if there are human rights, we must lay aside an approach to ethics that is consequentialist or utilitarian. At a very general level, they treat us, at a very general level, they direct us in just the way Kant directed us, to treat human beings, ourselves and others, as ends and not only as means. Now, of course, all the time we treat each other as means. When I pay for my taxi ride, I'm paying the driver to take me to the destination. One could say, in a sense, I'm using the taxi driver as a means, but not as a means only. Not as a means only. Reducing him to the status of the instrumentality he's driving. Treating him the way I might treat the car. Dispose of it when it's too old or not properly functioning or whatever. Now, when we begin to specify this general norm, we identify both negative and positive duties and corresponding rights. Although we need not put the matter in terms of rights, it's perfectly reasonable and I believe helpful to speak of a right against, for example, being enslaved. Just to take an uncontroversial example today. We have many controversies in ethics today, but one is not slavery. Almost everyone agrees slavery is wrong, slavery is a violation of rights. So let's just stay with an uncontroversial example. If there is a right against being enslaved, then it's a right people have not by virtue of being members of a certain race or sex or ethnic group or class, but simply by virtue of our humanity. It is in that sense that it is a human right. When we say that the right against being enslaved is a human right, when we say that slavery violates human rights, we mean that it violates a right I have by virtue of being human, and that all human beings have, not just some. It does not depend on anything that is particular to me, my ethnic background, my sex, my race. But there are, in addition to negative duties and their corresponding rights, certain positive duties. And these too can be articulated and discussed in the language of rights, though here it is especially important that we be clear about by whom and how a given right is to be honored. Sometimes it is said, for example, that education or health care is a human right. Now, it's not unreasonable to speak in this way, but much more needs to be said if it is to be a meaningful statement. Who is supposed to provide education or health care to whom? Why should those persons and institutions be the providers, not some other persons or institutions? What place should the provision of education and health care occupy on the list of social and political priorities? Since there are many goods, many good things, many things that we could use our common effort to realize and achieve, but our resources are limited, how do we make decisions about where on the list of priorities to put education or health care? Perhaps very, very high. But an argument needs to be made as to why it should be very, very high. Should education be above health care, or should health care be above education? Are there some things that are above both of them? An argument needs to be made. And we can ask more questions. Is it better for education and health care to be provided by governments under socialized systems or by private providers in markets? This question does not answer itself. We need to do the hard thinking, not only in philosophy, but in sociology and in economics, to determine what the best answer to the question is. Should it be government as the provider? Should it be the market? Should it be some mix of government and market? What degree of regulation should there be? What is too little? What is too much? These questions must be resolved. It does not make any sense to speak of a right to education or health care if one is unwilling to face these very important questions. If the right is to be meaningful, the statement is to be meaningful. Now, these questions, as I say, go beyond the application of moral principles. They require prudential judgment in light of the contingent circumstances people face in a given society at a given point in time. Often there is no single, uniquely correct, universal answer. It might be that in one society, given its conditions, its history, its traditions, one system of healthcare or education would be better, but in a different society, a different system would be better. Again, because of its contingent circumstances, traditions, and history. The answer to each of the questions I'm raising can lead to further questions, and the issues can become extremely complex, far more complex than the issue of slavery, where once a right has been identified, its universality and the basic terms of its application are fairly clear. Everybody has a moral right not to be enslaved, and everybody has a moral obligation, as a strict matter of justice, to refrain from enslaving others. And of course, governments have an obligation to respect and protect the right against being enslaved, not only to refuse to become involved with the institution of slavery, but to prevent citizens from enslaving other citizens. Now, what I've said so far will provide, I hope, a pretty good idea of how I think we ought to go about identifying what are human rights. I hope in a way that will avoid an inflation of what Marianne Glendon calls rights talk, where everyone claims that anything that it would be good to have is a right. This inflation is very damaging, not least to the true concept of a right, and to the dignity and standing of those rights that ought to be acknowledged precisely as rights. In any event, in each case, if someone wants to claim that there is a right to this or to that, negative or positive, the argument must be made, and there are complexities to the argument. Now, one basic human right that almost all natural law theorists would say belongs in the set of rights is the right of an innocent person not to be directly killed or maimed. This is a right that is violated when someone makes the death or injury of another person the precise object of his action. It is the right that grounds the norm against targeting non-combatants, even in justified wars, and against abortion, euthanasia, torture, the killing of hostages, and so forth. Of course, in the case of abortion, some people argue that human beings in the embryonic or fetal stages of development do not yet qualify as persons and so do not possess human rights. And in the case of euthanasia, some argue that permanently comatose or severely retarded or demented people do not or no longer qualify as rights bearers. Now, I think these claims are mistaken, but I will not here go into my reasons for holding that the moral status of a human being does not depend on his or her age or size or stage of development or condition of dependency. I presented the argument in great detail in numerous places, including my new book, Embryo, A Defense of Human Life, which Professor Espada kindly mentioned. I presented it in more compact form recently in the journal Daedalus, the Journal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Here, I only will say that people who do not share with me the conviction that the human being in the earliest stages of development, or the human being in severely debilitated conditions, are rights bearers, may nevertheless agree that whoever qualifies as a person is protected by the norm against direct killing of the innocent. Now, the natural law understanding of human rights that I'm here sketching is connected with a particular account of human dignity. Under that account, the natural capacities for reason and freedom are fundamental to the dignity of human beings, the dignity that is protected by human rights. The basic goods of human nature, those fundamental aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, are goods of a rational creature, a creature who, unless impaired or prevented from doing so, naturally develops and exercises capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice. The capacities that we are here today exercising. When I speak, setting forth some propositions and arguments, when you listen to try to understand what I'm saying, to evaluate what I'm saying, decide whether what I'm saying is right or wrong, we're exercising these rational capacities. We possess these capacities, albeit in radical or root form, from the very origins of our existence as human beings. Even when we were babies, or before that, even in the embryonic stage, we possessed in radical form these capacities that would unfold as part of our human nature. And we do not exercise them all the time. When we're sleeping, we don't exercise them. A person in a coma or a minimally conscious state would not be exercising them. But even a person in a coma or a permanent, persistently minimally conscious state remains a person with a human nature, a being with a human nature, a human being, although there's something that is impairing that human being, at least for the time being. Now, these capacities, the capacities possessed by creatures with a human nature, by human beings, these capacities are God-like. God-like, albeit, of course, in a limited way. In fact, from the theological vantage point, they constitute a certain sharing, limited to be sure, but real, in divine power. This is what is meant, I believe, by the otherwise extraordinarily puzzling teaching of the Bible that man is made in the very image and likeness of God. I mean, what could this mean when we read in the Bible that man is made in the image and likeness of God? Does it mean that God has 5 fingers on each hand? Or that God has a nose? No. So what could it mean? If it's not our physical qualities that reflect the image of God, what is it? Whether it's true or false, what is the Bible asserting? Well, it seems to me it's asserting something that, from a philosophical point of view, makes perfect sense. Even if we didn't have the Bible, we could still understand, even if we didn't believe in God, we could still understand that the special powers possessed by the human being are quite literally godlike. How? Well, whether or not one recognizes biblical authority or believes in a personal God, it is true that human beings possess a power traditionally ascribed to divinity. And not just by the Jews and not just by the Christians, but even in primitive cultures. The power traditionally ascribed to divinity is that power to be an uncaused causing. That power to cause effects in the world which one is not oneself caused to cause. In other words, the possession of freedom, the capacities for genuine deliberation, judgment, and choice. This is the power to envisage a possible state of affairs that does not yet exist, to grasp the value, the point, the intelligible point of bringing that state of affairs into existence by one's action, and then to act by choice and not merely on instinct or impulse like a brute animal to bring that state of affairs into existence. Now, that state of affairs may be anything from the development of an intellectual skill to the attainment of an item of knowledge. It's what we envisage when we decide that we will do a master's program in the Institute for Political Studies. We envisage a situation where we know more than we know coming in. We have things to learn. We want to learn. We realize we can learn by signing up for the program, paying the fees, coming, sitting through the lectures, engaging with our fellow students, with our faculty. And then, if all goes well, by our chosen action, we bring into being a state of affairs that we had envisaged but didn't yet exist, a state of affairs where we have greater knowledge, greater understanding, greater intellectual skill. No one caused that to happen. It was a self-caused action. No one put a gun to the student's head. Nor was the student driven by instinct, like a bull or a dog. It was literally a free and intelligent choice, aimed at an intelligible good, a goal whose value could be understood by the student, applying what Aristotle called his practical intellect. Now, the state of affairs that one brings into existence by reason and freedom may or may not be something profound or important. It may be the appreciation of a work of art. It may be bringing about a marriage, getting there, being there. Its moral or cultural significance may be great or far more commonly comparatively minor. We exercise our freedom and our reason every day, usually in little things, sometimes in big and important things. What matters is not whether it's small or big in its significance. What matters, for the point I'm now making, is that our decisions, our actions are products of human reason and freedom. They are the fruit of deliberation, judgment, and choice. They are the fruit of the exercise of these literally godlike powers. Now, we may, if we like, we may consider as a further matter, an additional question, whether beings capable of these godlike powers could exist apart from a divine source and ground of their being. But that is a further question. It need not be answered in order to affirm the fact that we in fact possess those powers. The fact that we possess and exercise by our very nature powers that are godlike, powers to be an uncaused causing. So I don't think it makes sense to deny that beings whose nature is to develop and exercise such powers are lacking in dignity and human rights and may therefore be treated as mere objects or property or as instruments like cars or bank machines. We have a certain profound dignity, an inherent dignity, by virtue of those qualities which, again, from a theological vantage point, might be described as placing us between the brute animals and the angels. Now, what about the authority for this view of human nature, the human good, human dignity, and human rights? Well, natural law theorists, people like me, are interested in the intelligible reasons, the reasons people have for their choices and actions. We are particularly interested in reasons that can be identified and understood without appeal to any authority apart from the authority of reason itself. Now, this is not to deny that it is often reasonable to submit to religious authority or secular, such as legal authority, in deciding what to do and not to do. I'm not making a case for anarchy. This is not the case against authority. But it says that where authority has a valid claim, there must be reasons for that claim. We must have reasons to yield for authority. Indeed, natural law theorists have made important contributions to understanding why and how people can sometimes be morally bound in reason, to submit to and be guided in their actions by authority of various types. Think, for example, of the work of the late Yves Simon, or the late Elizabeth Anscombe, or the work of John Finnis at Oxford, identifying reasons for respecting certain types of authority, at least under certain conditions and in certain circumstances. But even here, when we're identifying reasons for authority, when we're validating authority, again, whether it's religious or secular, when we're identifying reasons for authority, our special concern is just that, with reasons people have for recognizing and honoring claims to authority. We do not believe that you can simply appeal to authority to justify authority. We want to know what the reasons are that I or you or members of our community should yield to, should submit to, should be guided by authority. What are the reasons? Now, one might then ask whether human beings are in fact rational, as I'm claiming we are, in anything more than an instrumental sense. And here we venture into a very large issue in moral and political philosophy. That is the question. Can we, in fact, as I am asserting we can, discern intelligible reasons for human choices and actions? Now, of course, everybody recognizes that some ends or purposes or goals pursued through human action are intelligible, at least insofar as they provide means to other ends. For example, people work to earn money. That's not the only reason they work. They find their work fulfilling. But one of the reasons we all work is to earn money. We can't get along without it. We need it. But it's not something we want for its own sake. We value money for its instrumental value. What we can purchase with it, what we can buy with it. Put it away in a bank if we can find a secure bank. Put it away for someday when we need it, for our retirement, the pension, and so forth. Money is something not worthwhile in itself, but worthwhile in a very important way for its instrumental value. And no one doubts its instrumental value. There are no skeptics about value when it comes to money. The question is whether some ends or purposes are intelligible as providing more than merely instrumental reasons for action. That's the question. I'm assuming and asserting that there are such reasons, more than merely instrumental reasons for our actions. The question is, are there intrinsic as well as instrumental goods? Well, skeptics deny that there are intelligible ends or purposes that make possible rationally motivated action. Natural law theorists, by contrast, hold that friendship, knowledge of the sort that we are pursuing today, critical aesthetic appreciation, the appreciation of skillful performance or beautiful form, and certain other ends or purposes are intrinsically and not merely instrumentally valuable. We believe that one has reason to have a friend and to be a friend that is not merely instrumental. In fact, if one treated one's friend merely as instrumentally worthwhile, or treated a friendship with someone merely as instrumental, valued it only for what he could get out of it, instrumentally, it wouldn't be a friendship. It would be a mockery of a friendship. So we believe that there are intelligibly choice-worthy ends that are not merely means to other ends, but are worthwhile for their own sake and valuable, understood as valuable for their own sake. They cannot be reduced, nor can their intelligible appeal be accounted for exclusively in terms of emotion, feeling, desire, or other sub-rational motivating factors. These basic human goods are constitutive aspects of the well-being and fulfillment of human persons and the communities they form. That's what I meant by that very opaque and abstract opening paragraph. These goods thereby provide the foundations of moral judgment, including our judgments pertaining to justice and human rights. It is these basic aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, things that we can understand as worthwhile in themselves and act for the sake of, without being caused to act. It is their integral directiveness that is the touchstone of morality, of rectitude in willing. When our will is oriented favorably toward the human good considered in its integral wholeness, then we are acting in a morally good way. Our will is rectified. We are acting with a good will. When we deviate from that, perhaps because of the emotional appeal of doing something that would violate some aspect of the human good, or would treat a person, whether oneself or another, as a mere instrumentality, then we veer off into what is morally wrong. Now, of course, there are plenty of people today who embrace philosophical or ideological doctrines that deny the human capacities I maintain are at the core of human dignity. They adopt a purely instrumental and essentially non-cognitivist view of practical reason. In other words, they embrace the view that was made famous by David Hume in the 18th century. Do you remember what Hume said about reason? He denied exactly what I'm affirming today. I'm affirming that reason can identify that which is intelligibly choiceworthy, not merely as a means to other ends, but as an end in itself. I give you friendship as an example, or the pursuit of intellectual knowledge. Hume denies this. Hume's view, and here's how he put it, is that reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them. In Hume's view, reason can tell us only how to get what we want, where our wants are given not by our intelligent grasp of what is intelligibly choiceworthy, but are given by emotion, feeling, some other sub-rational motivator. So this is the great divide. This is the great divide in moral and political theory. Hume's view is that our practical reason is only instrumental. My view is that we are capable of more than that. Now, if one embraces Hume's view, then one will notice, of course, that people think that they are acting freely, deliberating and judging. People think they are acting for reasons and not merely on emotion or feeling. People think that they are uncaused but are causing. But the reality will be, for the Humean, that one is actually not free. One is determined either by some external force or by internal compulsion, by one's desires, feelings, emotions, which at the end of the day call the tune. He will think that the ends that people pursue are ultimately given by these non-rational motivating factors. There's a famous statement by Hume's predecessor, Thomas Hobbes, the British political thinker. Hobbes said that the thoughts are to the desires, as scouts and spies to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired. In other words, the purpose of the mind, the role of the mind in ethical thinking, is not to figure out what to want. It's not to identify what it would be good to want. No, it's to range abroad and find the way to the thing desired, where desire is given, not by reason, but by emotion. So on this view, of course, Hitler and Mother Teresa both have desires. Reason cannot adjudicate between the desires. Hitler may want to push people into ovens. Mother Teresa might want to save people on the streets of Calcutta. Now, reason can tell Hitler how to get more people into the ovens, and tell Mother Teresa how to save more people on the streets of Calcutta. But reason can't, on this view, adjudicate between what Mother Teresa happens to desire and what Hitler happens to desire. Those are given, not by reason, but by feeling, emotion, something that is subjective, not objective. Something that is not subject to the possibility of rational criticism. So truly rationally motivated action on the Humean and Hobbesian account is impossible for creatures like us. There are no more than merely instrumental reasons for action, no basic human goods. Now, if proponents, advocates of this non-cognitivist and subjectivist view of human action, the instrumental view of practical reason, are right, then it seems to me that the entire business of ethics is a charade and human dignity is a myth. Now, there's some people who contest that. You might, if you're interested, have a look at a debate that I did a few years ago with the British Humean philosopher, the Australian Humean philosopher Geoffrey Goldsworthy. But it does seem to me that if in the end we cannot adjudicate between the fundamental goals of Hitler and Mother Teresa, then we're out of the game of ethics. The ethics is just impossible. And the idea that there's human dignity must be a myth. But I don't think they are right. Indeed, I don't think that they can give any account of the norms of rationality to which they must themselves appeal in making the case, their case, against reason and freedom that is consistent with the denial that people are capable of more than merely instrumental rationality and true freedom of choice. In other words, the argument I would run against my Humean and Hobbesian friends, and which I have run against Professor Goldsworthy, is that in making the very argument that they want to make for the Humean position against the possibility of more than merely instrumental reasoning and true freedom, in making the case they are presupposing the possibility of seeking knowledge for its own sake and acting freely on the norms of rationality that must be observed if knowledge is to be intelligently pursued. So the argument I propose against them is a retorsive argument that's meant to show the self-defeating quality of the proposition contrary. Now, I do not deny that emotion figures in human action. Obviously it does, and on many occasions, it or some other sub-rational factor does the main work of motivation. If a person is thirsty, he goes and he gets a drink. There's not a lot of mental activity that goes on there. That is kind of like what a dog would. My dog, when he's thirsty, goes over to the bowl, he gets a drink. So I'm not saying that human beings are rational and only rational and sub-rational motivating factors are no part of the human picture. Obviously, that's not the debate. The debate is whether, in addition to sub-rational motivating factors, like desire, like emotion, feeling, in addition to those, whether there are more than merely instrumental reasons that we're capable of apprehending and acting on. And I believe that there are, and that these two figure in motivation. Now, if I and other natural law theorists are correct in affirming that human reason can identify human rights as genuine grounds of obligation to others, because there genuinely are human goods, there genuinely is an integral human good, and to act in conformity with the integral good, or the human good integrally conceived, one must respect the legitimate interests of others, and that's what we mean by rights. If all that's true, then how can I explain or understand, how can we understand, widespread failures to recognize and respect human rights and other moral principles? When one argues for a natural law position or any form of moral objectivism, or for the idea that there is just some fundamental human morality or human rights, skeptics will sometimes say, well, how can that be true since we know that human history is littered with people doing all sorts of things which you natural law theorists or you moral objectivists claim are morally wrong and unreasonable? Well, as human beings, we are rational animals, but we are imperfectly rational. Now, anybody can understand that. You don't have to be a Christian to understand that. I think if there's one constant about which people are securely knowledgeable, it's that human beings are imperfect. Christians have a particular account of that. We call it original sin. But you don't have to be a Christian, or you don't have to have that account of it to understand that people, though rational, are capable of going astray, going awry. We are certainly imperfectly rational. Aristotle was a great celebrator of our rationality, but he understood, he knew, that the whole reason to do ethics was to keep ourselves from going astray, to develop virtue so that we would not give in to those imperfections that would lead us to do things that are bad. We are prone to making intellectual and moral mistakes and capable of behaving grossly unreasonably, especially when deflected by powerful emotions that run contrary to the demands of reason. We all have the experience, do we not, of knowing what the right thing to do is in a particular difficult case, but having a powerful aversion to doing it, or there being a powerful attraction to doing something contrary to it. Sometimes we're able to call that temptation. Sometimes we're able to resist. Good for us. But we all have the experience, because we're all imperfect, of sometimes yielding. That's human. That's human. Even when following our consciences, as of course we are morally bound to do, we can go wrong. A conscientious judgment may nevertheless be erroneous. Of course, sometimes people fail to recognize and respect human rights because they have self-interested motives for doing so. Sometimes the existence of a human right is pretty clear. There were people when slavery existed in my country, like Thomas Jefferson. He was a great American, a great thinker, author of our Declaration of Independence, a great scholar. But he owned slaves. Now, at some level, Jefferson, we know from his writings, knew that there was something very bad about treating human beings as property. But he was very deeply, personally invested in a style of life that he could only lead with the slaves on his plantation in Monticello. So self-interest prevented him from fully seeing and understanding the implications of slavery. And in most cases of exploitation, the failing is like that. It's fundamentally moral, not intellectual. In some cases, though, intellectual and moral failures are closely connected. Selfishness, prejudice, partisanship, greed, vanity, lust, ill will, and other moral delinquencies can, in ways that are sometimes quite subtle, we all have that experience as well, impede sound ethical judgments, including judgments pertaining to human rights. Whole cultures or subcultures can be infected with moral failings that blind large numbers of people to truths about justice and human rights. And ideologies hostile to these truths will almost always be both causes and effects of these failings. Now, in my country these days, at least in the elite sector of the culture, it's very politically incorrect to say something like that. That whole subcultures can be infected with moral failings. It's a violation of this new deity that we've created called multiculturalism. We're supposed to have all respect for all cultures and say that they're all equal and all good and so forth and so on. But we all know that's false. Consider again the example of slavery in my own country prior to the American Civil War. The ideology of white supremacy, which governed the culture of that time, was both a cause of many people's blindness to the wickedness of slavery, including otherwise good people like Jefferson, or like Robert E. Lee, the great Southern general, who's a good man, or the president of the Confederacy, whose name was Jefferson Davis. He's a very honorable man, would never tell a lie. If he handed the store clerk a $10 note, and he was due back $3 and she gave him $5, he would return the $2. A very honorable man, but who believed in slavery, was part of a subculture in which the ideology of white supremacy had infected people like him with the belief in slavery, a belief that blinded him to the very exploitation that he was involved in and the degradation of the victims, the slaves. Okay, now let's turn to the question of God and religious faith. Most, but not all, natural law theorists are theists. They believe that the moral order, like every other order in human experience, is what it is because God creates and sustains it as such. In accounting for the intelligibility of the created order, they infer the existence of a free and creative intelligence, that is, a personal God. Indeed, they typically argue that God's creative free choice provides the only ultimately satisfactory account of the existence of the intelligibilities humans grasp in every domain of inquiry, not just in ethics, but say in the domain of inquiry in which we inquire into natural phenomena, chemistry, physics, or social phenomena, political science, economics, or the domain of inquiry where we inquire into the intelligibilities of the logical order, identify contradictions and principles of logic, or the intelligibilities that we find in the technical order, where we seek to bring efficient means to bear to achieve preordained ends. Now, natural law theorists do not deny that God can reveal moral truths, and most believe that God has chosen to reveal many such truths. The Ten Commandments, at least the right-hand side of the Ten Commandments, Commandments 4 through 10, are regarded by natural law theorists as truths that are revealed but can be known even apart from revelation. They assert, with St. Paul in the second chapter of the letter to the Romans, that there is a law written on the hearts, even of the Gentiles, St. Paul said, who did not know the law of Moses, a law the knowledge of which is sufficient for moral accountability. Paul looked out at the world and he realized that people who didn't have the revelation to the Jews, didn't have the scriptures, nevertheless, very often did the right thing and did it for the right reason. He could make sense of that. Why? Because in addition to the written law given to Moses, there's the law written on the heart, the natural law, the law that we're capable of understanding, the law or the set of principles that Aristotle and Plato were interested in understanding and promoting. So the basic norms against murder and theft, for example, are knowable even apart from God's special revelation. The natural law can be known to us, by us, and we can conform our conduct to its terms by virtue of our natural capacities for deliberation, judgment, and choice, what the late John Rawls called our common human reason. The absence of a divine source of the natural law would be a puzzling thing, just as the absence of a divine source of any and every other intelligible order in human experience would be a puzzling thing. How there can be an order of logic, how there can be intelligibilities in the world that make physics and chemistry possible. Now, an atheist's puzzlement might well cause him to reconsider the idea that there is no divine source of the order we perceive and understand in the universe. It's far less likely, I think, to cause someone to conclude that our perception is illusory or that our understanding is a sham, though that is certainly logically possible. The question then arises, can natural law, assuming that there are principles of natural law, provide common moral and even political ground for people who do not agree on the existence or nature of God and the role of God in human affairs? Can it provide common ground for Christians and Muslims and Jews and Hindus and people who do not believe? Well, in my view, anybody who acknowledges the capacities for reason and freedom has good grounds for affirming human dignity and basic human rights. I've already given you the argument for that. For affirming the godlike powers and therefore the godlike status of the human person. These grounds remain in place whether or not one adverts to that additional question. The question, is there a divine source of the moral order whose tenets we discern in inquiry regarding natural law and natural rights? Now, I happen to think that the answer to that question is yes, so I affirm the theistic point of view, and that we should be open, therefore, to the possibility that God has revealed himself in ways that reinforce and supplement what can be known by unaided reason. So I believe that there's a harmony of faith and reason. But no one need agree with me about that. In fact, we needn't agree, even across cultures, about that. The answer to the question, is there a divine source? So long as we agree about the truths that give rise to the question. Namely, here are the truths, that human beings possessing godlike, literally awesome, awe-inspiring powers of reasoning freedom, powers to be uncaused causings, are bearers of a profound dignity that is protected by certain basic rights. I commend to you the wonderful book written by my friend Marianne Glendon of the Harvard Law School on the UN Declaration, the drafting of the UN Declaration on Human Rights in 1948. You've celebrated it at the conference here in the Institute. Glendon tells the story of people from different traditions, from the Chinese Confucian tradition, of course from the Christian tradition, from the Jewish tradition, coming together, not because they all saw the religious question the same way, they didn't. There were varying degrees of differences of opinion. The difference between the Christians and the Jews was pretty small, but the difference between the Christians and the Jews on the one hand and the Buddhists and the Confucianists on the other hand were quite wide. But nevertheless, what they could agree on from their different religious perspectives is the profound dignity of the human person. And it's on that basis that they could ascribe, across the lines of cultural and religious division, dignity and rights to every human person. No one is to be enslaved. No one is to be reduced to the status of property. No one is to be used as a mere means. So if there is a set of moral norms, including norms of justice and human rights that can be known by rational inquiry, understanding, and judgment, even apart from special revelation, then these norms of natural law can provide the basis of a common understanding of human rights, an understanding that can be shared even in the absence of religious agreement. Of course, we should not expect consensus. That's not possible. I think we can get a wide degree of agreement but these are complicated issues on which reasonable people disagree in a significant range of territory when it comes to moral questions. So we cannot expect consensus. There are, after all, moral skeptics who deny that there are any moral truths. They're not even in the moral argument. There are religious fideists who hold that moral truths can be known only from God's special revelation, cannot be known by any kind of rational inquiry. And fideism is something that itself transcends religions. There are Islamic fideists, there are Christian fideists, there are Jewish fideists. Now, of course, there are people within those traditions who reject fideism as well. And even among those who believe in natural law, there will be differences of opinion about its precise content and implications for certain issues. Some issues are just very, very hard. It's easy to get it wrong, hard to get it right. Reasonable people, even sharing the same basic structure of thought about ethics, may come to differences of opinion. So it is, I believe, our permanent condition to discuss and debate these issues. There is no end of moral history. Both as a matter of abstract philosophy, we will debate them, and as a matter of practical politics. Now, I hope that we will debate them within a framework which is itself morally good and reasonable and can be affirmed, a fundamental democratic framework. But we will have to debate them. Now, it's sometimes regarded as an embarrassment to natural law thinking that some great ancient and medieval figures in the natural law tradition failed to recognize, and indeed have even denied, human rights that are affirmed by contemporary natural law theorists and even regarded as fundamental. Consider, for example, the basic human right to religious liberty. This right was not widely acknowledged in the past and was even denied by some prominent natural law theorists. As Professor Finnis has observed, these people wrongly believed that a wide or robust conception of liberty in matters of religious faith presupposed religious relativism or indifferentism, or entailed that religious vows were immoral or non-binding, or the comprehensive subservience of ecclesial communities to the state. In other words, they identified religious liberty with what some of the French revolutionaries regarded as religious liberty. But that was a mistake, as Finnis points out. When the Catholic Church put itself on record firmly in support of the robust conception of the right to religious freedom in the document Dignitatis Humanae of the Second Vatican Council, the Fathers of the Council presented two arguments. One, and the first argument, was a natural law argument, and then the second was an argument from specifically theological sources. The natural law argument for religious liberty is founded on the obligation of each person to pursue the truth about matters of religion and to live in conformity with his best judgments, his conscientious judgments of the truth. Again, respect for the human person is what's driving this train. It is for the good of the human person, for him to genuinely, sincerely pursue the truth on religious matters, and then live as best he can in conformity with his best judgments, his conscientious judgments. This obligation is in turn rooted in the proposition that religion, considered as conscientious truth-seeking regarding the ultimate sources of meaning and value, is itself a crucial dimension of human well-being and fulfillment, just like friendship and knowledge and aesthetic appreciation, the pursuit of justice or the pursuit of virtue. So too, living in harmony with the gods, if there are gods, or with God, or if there is no God, living a life of integrity despite the fact that there is no God. That has value for the human being that is not merely instrumental. So it's rooted in the concept that man's good includes his good as a truth seeker. It is among the basic human goods that provide rational motivation for our choosing. The robust right to religious liberty follows then from the dignity of man as a conscientious truth seeker. This right and other human rights are denied and attacked today from various quarters. And in many parts of the world, of course, they are routinely violated. We all know, I was just watching one of the British channels today on television. I was talking about some appalling crimes in the name of religion against the freedom of religion, against religious minorities, specifically for religious reasons. So we know that this is a battle for religious freedom, which is far from won. Now, the ideological justification for the denial of religious freedom and the violation of the right to religious freedom can be religious, of course, but it can also be secular. In some parts of the world, religious freedom and other basic human rights are denied in the name of theological truth. In other parts of the world, the threats are from secularist ideologies, and we know from the experience of the 20th century. especially with Hitler and Stalin, that religious freedom could be violated in the name of secular, as well as religious goals. Where secularist ideologies are liberal in form, as we use that term in the United States at least, I know it's used differently to some extent in Europe, it's often claims to an overarching right to personal autonomy that are asserted to justify choices and actions and policies that natural law theorists believe are unjust and undermine the common good. If the natural law view of these matters is correct, then it is moral failings conspiring with intellectual errors that sustain ideologies that compromise human rights. In a certain sense, the failings are at opposite poles. Yet from the natural law vantage point, partisans of the competing ideologies make valid criticisms of each other. Radical Islamists, for example, harshly condemn the decadent features of cultures in which an ideology of expressive or possessive individualism flourishes. They look at the West and they see pornography and promiscuity and other kinds of misbehavior, and they identify that with what we're about in the West. On the other side, expressive individualists denounce the subjugation of women and the oppression of religious dissenters where fundamentalist Islam holds sway. Sometimes they look at what the bad things that are done to women in some Islamic cultures, the oppression of religious dissenters, and they identify that with Islam. As natural law theorists see it, threats to human dignity and human rights exist because all of us as human beings are, as I said, imperfectly reasonable and imperfectly moral. We can go off the rails. At the same time, hope exists because we really do possess, as human beings, the capacities for reasonableness and virtue. Truth, including moral truth, is accessible to us and has its own splendor and powerful appeal. We will never, in this vale of tears, grasp the truth completely or in a way that is entirely free from errors. We're not perfect. We will not become perfect. Nor will we fully live up to the moral truths we grasp. All of us, to some extent, will suffer from the flaws of Jefferson, seeing the truth at least dimly, but at least with respect to some things not able fully to live up with it, or not willing fully to live up to it. But just as we made progress by abolishing the evil of slavery, by ending legally sanctioned racial segregation in my own country and elsewhere, by recognizing finally the robust conception of religious freedom, and by turning away from the eugenics policies once favored by so many respectable people, although I'm afraid that mentality is coming back a bit. Natural law theorists hope that we can make progress and reverse declines in other areas. Now, of course, people who reject the natural law understanding of human dignity and human rights will differ from natural law theorists on the question of what constitutes progress and what constitutes decline. There are differences of opinion here. From a radical Islamist point of view, the type of religious freedom defended by natural law theorists like me will be regarded as licensing heresy and religious irresponsibility, violating, for example, the Sharia prohibition against converting from Islam. Natural law ideas will be seen by them just as rhetorically toned down forms of Western liberal secularism. By contrast, from a liberal secularist point of view, natural law ideas about abortion, sexuality, and other hot-button moral issues will be regarded as intolerant and oppressive, a philosophically gussied-up form of religious fundamentalism. In the end, though, natural law ideas, like Islamist ideas or like liberal secularist ideas, will have to stand or fall on their own merits. No one should be privileged in the argument as having the default position. All the positions are in play in the argument. All should be considered on their merits and rejected or accepted on their merits. Anyone who wonders whether my view or the view of an Islamist or the view of a secular liberal are sound or unsound will have to consider the arguments offered in their support and the counter-arguments advanced by their critics. Let me say a word now about the way in which natural law theories are both like and unlike utilitarian and other consequentialist approaches to morality on the one hand, and Kantian or deontological approaches on the other. Like utilitarian approaches, and unlike Kantian ones, natural law theories are fundamentally concerned with human well-being and fulfillment, and indeed take the basic human goods as the starting point of ethical reflection, and take the integral directiveness of the basic forms of human good as the touchstone of morality. Unlike utilitarian approaches, however, natural law theorists understand the basic forms of human good as they figure in options for morally significant choosing as incommensurable in ways that render senseless the utilitarian strategy of choosing the option that overall and in the long run promises to conduce to the net best proportion of benefit to harm, however benefit and harm are described. There's no proposition in ethics that seems, until you think about it, more self-evidently true than the utilitarian proposition. After all, who would want to go contrary to the idea that we should choose that option among competing options, which overall and in the long run will conduce to the net best proportion of benefit to harm? I mean, would you want to choose an option that does less than that? No. But there's a fundamental problem with the view, and that is that there is no net best proportion of benefit to harm, because the human good is variegated in ways that make commensuration of the goods so that we can do a utilitarian calculation literally unworkable, impossible. And that really is the Achilles heel. There are a lot of things wrong with utilitarianism. You can't predict consequences. They render every end a means and nothing ultimately an end. You're probably more than familiar with all these different arguments. But it seems to me that the most fundamental one, the one that goes to the very heart of the thing, is the incommensurability point. The human good just isn't structured the way utilitarians think, or presuppose without thinking. Too often just presuppose without critically thinking about it, that it is. Now, how about Kantians? Well, natural law theorists share with Kantians the rejection of aggregative accounts of morality, like utilitarian accounts, that regard the achievement of sufficiently good consequences or the avoidance of sufficiently bad ones as justifying choices that would be excluded by the application of moral norms in ordinary circumstances. Unlike Kantians, however, they do not believe that moral norms can be identified and justified apart from a consideration of the integral directiveness of the principles of practical reason directing human choice and action toward what is humanly fulfilling and away from what is contrary to human well-being. The reason Kantianism always sounds like it's purely formal and detached from what's truly human, and therefore just sort of floating above what we're supposed to be thinking about when we're figuring out what to do in situations of moral quandary. The reason for that is that there is no consideration of the human good at the heart of the thing, unless it's slipped in illicit, unless it's just doing background work without the theorists admitting that it's there. Kantianism, when it's really done rigorously, sounds formal because it is formal. It's detached from the human good. And the one thing the utilitarians have right in my view is precisely what the Kantians have wrong. The utilitarians are right that ethics fundamentally is about human well-being. It's about the human good. Natural law theorists do not believe in purely deontological norms. Practical reasoning is reasoning about both the right and the good. And the two are connected. The content of the human good shapes moral norms inasmuch as such norms are entailments of the basic aspects of human well-being and fulfillment considered integrally. Well, I'll conclude with one more proposition, namely that by our choices and actions, we do not only alter states of affairs in the world external to us, but also at the same time determine and constitute ourselves, for better or worse, as persons with a certain character. Here again, I'm appealing to a classic Aristotelian point. When we act, we're usually not worried about or focusing on what the implications of the action are for our own character. We're not looking at the intransitive consequences of the action. When we're thinking about whether to do something, whether to come here this evening, whether to give the shop clerk back the $2, the $2 extra that she's given me by mistake. When I'm deliberating about that, I'm usually not thinking about my own character and what the impact is. I'm usually thinking about the affairs of the world, how I'm going to make the world different, what's happening out there. But it is true, as Aristotle pointed out from the very beginning of reflection on ethics, that whether we're thinking about it or not, when we act, not only do we make the world different from what it was before we acted, we also have an impact on ourselves. Recognition of this self-shaping or intransitive quality of morally significant choosing leads to a focus on virtues as habits born of upright choosing that orient and dispose us toward further upright choosing, especially in the face of powerful temptation to behave immorally. Now, people sometimes ask, it seems that wherever I go, because anybody who knows anything about debates in contemporary natural law theory will ask, well, Professor George, in your view, is natural law about rules or virtues? Because they know that there are some natural law theorists out there who say, I am a virtue theorist. And other natural law theorists who say, well, look, natural law is about law. It's about rules. So what do I think? In case you want to know. Is natural law about rules or virtues? Well, the answer is, of course, you can see it's about both. A complete theory of natural law identifying norms for distinguishing right from wrong, as well as habits or traits of character, virtues, whose cultivation disposes people to choose in conformity with those norms, with those rules, and thus compatibly with what we might call, borrowing yet another phrase from Kant, a good will. That is, a will toward integral human fulfillment. Thank you very, very much.